let's take a brief look at the planes, trains, and automobiles that made up the weaponry of World War I. First of all, we've got to start off by talking about the history of airplanes, which were fairly new at the time. I've included a link here for you. I'd like for you to go watch from the slides that I've provided you, but I normally don't share links from a show called Drunk History. Usually honestly, I find it a little offensive sometimes the way they treat history, but this one is a good one, and so I'm willing to share it with you for that reason. Not that I promote drinking or anything like that, but just because it's an interesting story. We overlook the Wright sister. We talk a lot about the Wright brothers. Anyway, take a look at that video. So Wilbur actually spoke to a group of engineers in Chicago at one point at a conference, and his topic was some aeronautical experiments, and he outlined 3 general problems with flight. One was that there was a construction problem related to sustaining wings. The other problem is that the generation or application of power to move the airplane was an issue because, it'd have to be heavy. And then the third problem was the balancing and steering of the machine once it was in air, because basically what they and other people had to go after was watching the one thing that they knew could fly, which were birds, and birds flap. So many early planes focused on trying to get those wings to flap. So this also sets trends, because Catherine was part of the flight testing and that sort of thing. In one particular flight, it would have been very immodest of Catherine to have flown in a plane, because these planes were all open. You've seen the pictures of them from the past, but these planes were open and she was wearing a dress. So it would be inappropriate for her to wear that dress and fly. So one of her brothers took a rope and tied it around the base of her dress, which created this look that became very trend-setting. It became known as the aviation skirt, and you can see a picture of one here on the right that was actually that's actually bound with an elastic kind of casing. So it's the hobble skirt, or also known as the aviation skirt, that was popular for a year, 1910 to 1911, and these were seen as very erotic because it created a bustle look, which means that it created the illusion of a plump, curvy behind. So while we wouldn't think of this look as particularly erotic today, it very much was in 1910. So the military use of airplanes, the first successful flight was actually in 1903. But very quickly after that, the military developed a need for these. They wanted right away to start initiating flight into military protection. So the Wrights began pretty immediately negotiating with the U.S. Army in 1905. So there were some problems with the negotiation. The U.S. government wouldn't give them money until they saw the plans, but the Wrights wouldn't share the plans till they had some cash in hand, which really kind of makes sense. Both sides have been burned before. So in order to remedy this problem, the United States puts the job up for bid in 1907, and the bid was to construct a plane that would fly. Well, the Wrights were the only ones in the U.S. who could meet those qualifications at the time. So this actually put the terms of negotiation then in the hands of the United States government. And the Wright brothers were paid $25,000 for this first plane. The first fatality came just a year later, in 1908. Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge was killed. Orville was also on that plane with him. He was flying it, and he was severely injured, but their sister Catherine took care of him, and which is another reason that she's important to flight as well. The average speed of this plane was 42.5 miles per hour, and the government actually gave the Wrights a bonus of $5,000 for getting it to go above 40 miles per hour. So I thought that was kind of cool too. And then the link here is just an article, if you are interested in reading more about aircraft, of the World War I aircraft from the time period. So just one more thing about the military use of planes before we move on to Other transportation, the Wrights sold another plane to the government in 1909, and then this plane was used to train pilots. It was called the Signal Corps Number 1. It was the Army plane, also known as the Wright Military Flyer. So this is actually the world's first military plane. Let's move on to railways. I see this and it reminds me so much of Thomas the Tank Engine. These railways were light railways. They were inexpensive, they were quick, they were made of lighter weight materials, and that was because they needed to be fast to put up and fast to take down. So the track was pretty much like a track you'd play with. You could easily move it around as needed. And these trains, these light railways, were used to supply ammunition and provide storage. So they were also used to transport soldiers and the wounded. They first started off, really their first use wasn't for war, it was for mining in France. But they were so lightweight and easy to maneuver that they very quickly became used in the war. In the daytime, they were pulled by animals rather than using steam or something like that, because they didn't want them to see the smoke coming, so people couldn't identify where they were. And then a problem with these, obviously, is that this was an issue because they derailed very easily. So if you can put something like this up very quickly, it can fall apart very quickly too, which was a problem. Automobiles come about in this time period too, and it makes sense that the early adopters of automobiles, the earliest drivers, were wealthy people. Ford had just really started beginning to mass produce the Model T. And we learned in the last unit that he paid his employees pretty well because he wanted them to be able to afford a car. So it was kind of self-serving in that way. But Ford was just starting to mass produce the Model T when war breaks out. At that point, people really have no need for cars, so production slacks a little. Horseback was still the go-to before World War I. And this picture is of the Vauxhall D-type, which transported royalty and high-ranking military officials during wartime. Sometimes they visit front lines or other camps, that sort of thing. So the autos used in World War I saved horses, because more than 8 million of them actually died in the war. The Vauxhall that I just showed you the picture of had bike-like tires that actually helped them carry passengers over some of the roughest, toughest roads. Vauxhall made 7 of these cars per week for the British, and by 1915 they got production up to 8 per week. So this wasn't a fast production at all. However, autos did not replace animals completely like horses or mules, because relying on machinery would have been problematic. One, you didn't have a lot of mechanics at the time because that was still new as well. So breakdowns, you didn't want to be stuck with an auto that you couldn't use. So animals were still largely used in World War I. We also have tanks that are developed in this time period. So tanks were used pretty much to break the stalemate of trench warfare. If you see these, the guns at the top here, you could drive between trenches and shoot down into the trenches, which obviously is dangerous if you're in a trench, right? But anyway, this is a way that people actually kind of started getting the upper hand. The British and the French were the major tank users in World War I. Germany didn't use them as much because they saw it as a defensive strategy. They didn't want to be on the defense, they were on the offense. So Germany didn't use them as much. They were used to destroy enemy gun posts and to break through barbed wire because they could just roll right over it. And then lastly, the armored car or armored truck. These were used, the body armor was added over commercial car or truck chassis to create this kind of protection for military use. And that's a quick look at the trains, planes, and automobiles used during World War I.